Hello. I'm going to try recording this lecture from a different location on this nice sunny day as we turn now to Racine's Phaedra. In doing so, we move forward in time, but not as much as we have earlier, because having jumped nearly 2,000 years from the ancient Greeks to Shakespeare's Elizabeth in England, today we move ahead historically only about 75 years from Othello to Racine's Phaedra, which was written in 1677. But we do shift now from England to France, where Jean Racine, the greatest tragedian of the neoclassical age, wrote plays during the reign of Louis XIV, the so-called Sun King at the very height of French monarchical opulence. So devoted were the French dramatists of this time to the classical tradition of ancient Greece that Racine and his contemporary Pierre Corneille, the dominant tragedians of the time, used the tales of Greek mythology exclusively for the subjects and plots of their plays. Now, Phaedra is Racine's masterpiece, but he was also the author of many other tragedies modeled on classical myths, which include, among others, Berenice, Mithridate, and Iphigenie. Now, as those titles suggest, many of his plays deal with tragic women because, like Euripides, one of the hallmarks of Racine's work is a fascination with passionate, complex females who are struggling with fierce inner conflicts. In fact, Euripides himself wrote two plays based on the Phaedra myth that unquestionably influenced Racine's own version. That said, we should note at the start that unlike ancient Greece and unlike Elizabethan England, there were no restrictions in 17th century France on women appearing on stage in the title roles of plays like Phaedra. In fact, it is true that while the Catholic Church condemned this practice and even excommunicated women who performed on stage, nonetheless it is true that Phaedra, unlike Electra or Medea or Desdemona, would have been played by a female, not an adolescent male, as in Elizabethan England, as in ancient Greece. Now, while this is an important difference, say, from Greek theater, nevertheless, Racine shared other similarities with his predecessors, the ancient Greeks, who he imitated as much as possible. For example, like the Greeks, and for that matter like Shakespeare, Racine composed his tragedies in verse, in rhyming couplets, though not necessarily in all translations. In short, like Shakespeare and like the ancient Greeks, he wrote works of dramatic poetry. But even though Racine, as I've noted, celebrates and imitates the classical tradition in this respect and many others, one notable departure that I think you probably recognized is that he dispenses with the Greek chorus. And one might also note that although there is frequent mention of the gods in Phaedra, they play no actual role in the drama per se, or at least no really important role, because Racine is, after all, writing for a Christian audience. Instead, I think, Racine invites us to interpret what his characters refer to as the Greek gods, instead as manifestations of psychological and at times even biological forces within the characters themselves. Now, Racine and his French contemporaries did abide more seriously by other conventions of ancient Greek theater, including some that Shakespeare and his English contemporaries had abandoned. In particular, we find in Racine something missing in Shakespeare, and that is the classical unities of time and place that we saw in Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides. The entire action of French neoclassical tragedies like Phaedra unfolds in a single location, much as, say, Electra does in Sophocles. There are no breaks or advances in the unfolding of time, the way there clearly are, say, in Hamlet or Othello. Now, Racine's personal background had a profound influence on his view of the world, and his dramas reflect that worldview in complex ways. Racine received his education in a famous and highly controversial religious abbey called Port Royal, which was associated with a particular Catholic sect called the Jansenists, who were inspired by the writings of an early 17th century theologian named Cornelius Jansen. Their ideas were considered so threatening and heretical by the dominant Catholic Church establishment that Jansenism was brutally repressed during Racine's lifetime, so that he couldn't be explicit about its ideas that find their way into his tragedies. But indeed, they do inform his dramas, I think, at every point, but indirectly. Now, the suppression by the Church of Jansenism was partly because the Jansenist sect resisted papal authority in Rome, but also it had to do with the Jansenist beliefs, which I'll describe in just a moment. Despite these restrictions, however, at Point Royal in school, Racine received an education that was suffused with the intellectual and spiritual tradition of Jansenism. He absorbed this as a young man, and most critics agree that this led to a prolonged Jansenist preoccupation in his plays, and most of all, in Phaedra. Now, there are two prominent tenets of Jansenism, I think, to bear in mind when we read this play. First, the Jansenists stressed the all-pervasiveness of human sinfulness and guilt. And second, they stressed the impossibility of any individual gaining redemption through prayer or atonement or virtuous action of any type. The reason the Jansenists believed such efforts were futile is that for them, our lives are predetermined before we were ever born. Very much the same idea that one finds in the Protestant realm in Calvinism. We are, the Jansenists believed, either predestined by God to be saved and taken to heaven entirely through God's mercy and nothing having to do with anything that we can possibly do, or we are from the beginning predestined to be damned, and justly so, the Jansenist believes, because of our inherent corruption. Free will, then, plays no role in Jansenism. It simply doesn't exist for them. Indeed, this is one of the reasons why the Church suppressed this doctrine, because the Jansenist heresy denied the possibility of individual agency and suggested that fallen man, from the time of the original sin thereafter, had no free will whatsoever. Well, if you eliminate that, and you eliminate any significant contribution of conscience to one's actions, then one might ask, what reason is there to try to be virtuous at all? Now, you can see how a Jansenist view of the world provides Racine with what Aristotle would call tragic necessity. Remember, Aristotle says there must be a sense of necessity in all great tragedies. And certainly in Racine, I think we'll find there is a sense of predeterminism rooted in the individual, certainly not in any sense of Greek gods, that is more powerful as an overriding and determining force than any force we find in Hamlet or Othello. To put it simply, there is more individual agency, I think, more responsibility for the individual to make determinate choices in his life in Shakespeare than there is in Racine. Now, for Racine, writing in 17th century France then, he didn't need classical gods to intervene when you have this sense of fatality operating, even though Racine doesn't refer, of course, to their Jansenist idea of the Jansenist God. He certainly implies it without ever explicitly identifying the source or the particular nature of that destiny within the plays, because to do so would have been very dangerous, particularly given the Catholic Church's feelings about the Jansenist heresy. Now, the Jansenists again held that mankind inhabits a world of perpetual sin and corruption, for which man, not God, is somehow responsible. So they believed that the only appropriate way to live in such a world was to try to withdraw from it as much as you could and spend one's life contemplating the moral abyss that divides evil mankind from God and his occasional mercy, at least mercy shown toward those few elect who, for whatever capricious reason, God has decided not to damn. All the rest of us are damned from the start. Now, we are damned in the Jansenist view no matter what we do. We are bound for hell. And monstrous as this might seem to us, and it certainly seems so to me, the Jansenists still have their adherents today, and they don't see God as fundamentally unjust. They hold instead that mankind is born tainted by Adam and Eve's original sin, and that thereafter there is no free will. Also, the Jansenists believe that we are sort of inherently unable to control our own desires by virtue of being mortal, and that, as bad as that is, we are least able to control our sinful desires when we are immersed in the social world. Thus, the Jansenists advocated fleeing that degraded social world that brings out our depravities all the more and living a life of remote meditation, even though in that state there is no possibility of saving our souls, nor of ever extirpating or uprooting our intrinsic human sinfulness. So the futility of man's ability to change the course of his spiritual destiny was, for the Jansenist, then still another reason to withdraw from the world of action, because the very attempt to resist one's desires in society and to try to in any way shape one's life in the social world in a purer way could only lead us, given our own depraved nature, to failure and pain. In solitude, the Jansenists believe we should then contemplate a depravity that we cannot change. This seems paradoxical, but it points to the importance of something we'll see in Phaedra, and that is the constant excoriating examination of conscience, the guilty conscience. Man can never really cleanse himself of that guilt for being a depraved creature, but nonetheless, the Jansenists expected that we would continually remind ourselves of how unworthy and how sin-riddled we are. Ultimately, then, in the Jansenist view, humankind, freedom is negated, really, in two respects. First, as I've noted, we're predestined by God to heaven or to hell. And second, we are unable to control the force of our sinful desires within us. All we can do is contemplate them. It is only, they argue, God's mercy that saves that small group of the elect, despite their incorrigible corruption. It's not as if they were born in any way purer than the rest of us. God makes his decisions mysteriously. So if there's nothing then that man possesses inwardly to combat his corruption, we are all inherently guilty, and we suffer all the more because we know that we are guilty, we know that we are evil, and though we struggle against it, cannot in any way remove that taint. Even though, like Phaedra, we may hate our sinful nature, our urge to sin, the Jansenist, and I think Racine suggests, is so deep and so strong that it becomes irresistible. Thus, guilt unavoidably deepens, and our inevitable failure to resist our sins only then increases our self-contempt in a vicious circle. Okay, now for Racine, where you might ask, does tragedy lie in this deterministic worldview? Well, Racine believed that human tragedy lies precisely in the struggle against what we cannot resist or overcome within ourselves. Indeed, Phaedra is a play about a woman who suffers tragically because she is consumed with guilt for her sinful urges, her passionate desire for Hippolytus, something that she cannot control even though she heroically tries and fails at various points. Specifically, then, she cannot control her illicit sexual desire for her stepson. The tragedy lies in the doomed effort and the awareness of her own corruption and the hatred of herself for it. This passionate desire for Hippolytus descends upon her as a kind of unavoidable and uncontrollable force. She'll call it the work of a god, but it is the upwelling of something we'll see within her. And her desire for Hippolytus is forbidden for various reasons, but the most important are that that desire is adulterous on the one hand, since she's married to Theseus, and it is also incestuous insofar as Hippolytus is her stepson. Now, the play's other central character, Hippolytus, Theseus' son and Phaedra's stepson, is the object of the non-reciprocating object of Phaedra's carnal longing. But he is ironically like her in that he too is afflicted against his will by his own forbidden sexual passion. In this case, not for Hippolyta, but rather for Aricia. Hippolytus's craving for her, Aricia, the survivor of the former ruling house of Athens, the house that King Theseus overthrew and then drove out, is one that makes his desire for her, of course, inherently transgressive in itself. Now, after Theseus conquered Aricia's family, he let Aricia live, but forbade her ever to marry in order to keep Aricia from reproducing a line that could then threaten to re-seize power in Athens. But Aricia loves Hippolytus, much as Hippolytus loves Aricia. He loves her guiltily, though, far more guiltily than she loves him, and the source of his guilt for his desire for her is twofold. First, it is wrong, he feels, because Theseus has forbidden such an alliance with an enemy family. And second, and perhaps more important, Hippolytus regards his passion as wrong and guilt-inducing because he has always viewed romantic love with disgust. Since his boyhood, he has pledged himself to a life of chastity and solitary hunting away from women, inspired by the goddess Artemis. Now, in the Greek myth upon which Phaedra is based, Aphrodite, the goddess of love, was attracted to Hippolytus, and when Hippolytus, being so virginal, spurned the goddess of love's advances, Aphrodite punished him by making Phaedra fall in love with him to their mutual destruction. Okay, we get that in Euripides, we get that in other ancient Greek versions. But in Racine's version in the 17th century, the forces of desire are not inflicted by Aphrodite as a kind of jealous punishment. No, they emerge from within the individual, these immoral, libidinal energies. They're not the product of a supernatural force, but it is an all-overpowering force, an all-determining force. But whatever the source, the fact is that both Phaedra and Hippolytus are visited by these forbidden desires that they cannot govern suddenly, compulsively, and that those desires fill them with dread and guilt, a sense of inner corruption, and a deep sense of inner conflict, as they are torn between trying to gratify them on the one hand and wanting to punish themselves for the very desires on the other. Both these characters, then, Phaedra and Hippolytus, feel a deep rift between what they view as a sexual depravity that they must struggle to try to hide or suppress on the one hand, and their desire to believe in uncorrupted ideals of conduct that in the face of these desires they know that they can never ever achieve. The very fact of the desires themselves seem to completely obliterate their conceptions of themselves as pure, their ideals of their own moral conduct. In short, these characters, who both define themselves in relation to sort of fixed, unattainable ideals of sexual restraint, are subverted by their unlawful, even criminal passions. And it is that sense of the extremity of their self-ideals in the face of their desires that make those desires all the more terrible to them. In short, we find then themes of deeply rooted guilt, of tragic inevitability, and as they meditate their own desires, of tortured introspection in Phaedra and to some extent in Hippolytus. And all of these three things, the deeply rooted guilt, the tragic inevitability, and the tortured introspection, are all central features of Jansenism, which Racine adopted in dramatizing a story from ancient Greece within his own Christian culture. Now, the helpless individual's doom struggle then, and the sense of a kind of irremediable guilt might lead one to protest that this very essence of Racine's tragedy seems to reflect a perversity in Racine's conception of the Christian God. What kind of a God would create man filled with these desires and then punish him for his inability to control them, and create individuals, most of whom are going to be damned no matter what they do? One might, from this perspective, suggest that the Jansenist God is a kind of fiend, but not for Racine. Now, from a psychological perspective, and one that we will be shortly adopting, one could well argue that Phaedra and Hippolytus' transgressive sexual desires emerge not despite the fact that the object of those desires are forbidden, but rather because of it. And also they erupt not just because of the forbidden nature of the object, but because the desire for that individual has been repressed for so long that it finally has to explode. Okay. Now, not surprisingly then, Freudian theorists see Phaedra as a kind of textbook illustration of the deranging effects of erotic self-denial, the way in which repressing one's erotic longing, even refusing to acknowledge it to others, can lead to madness and to illness. But for Racine, the sinful desire, while clearly corrupt, is also inherently tragic. And in making it tragic, we see, I think, the artist in Racine rise to some extent above the strict Jansenist, because most Jansenists would not suggest there is anything inherently tragic about struggling against our own depravity, doomed as we are to fail in it. Now, even though his plays then are infused with Jansenist ideas, unlike the Jansenist, Racine regards the struggle against desire as somehow ennobling, worthy of an audience's understanding, capable, to put it simply, of engendering our pity and fear as we see this doomed struggle. He makes this clear in his preface to Phaedra, where he suggests that he wanted to make Phaedra even more sympathetic and moving than Euripides had. And given the reverence for the classical authors, this departure seems to demand from him a particular explanation. And here's what Racine says in his preface. He says, "I have even been at pains to make Phaedra slightly less odious than in the tragedies of the ancients, where she resolves of her own accord to accuse Hippolytus. I felt that calumny was somehow too low for her, and foul to be put into the mouth of a princess whose sentiments were otherwise so noble and virtuous." Now, you'll note that in this instance, he wants to ennoble her more, he suggests, than Euripides does, in order to try to compensate for what he regards as the inherent taint of her unlawful sexual desire itself. And he seems also to feel the need to justify his departure from Euripides' portrait of Hippolytus. Of this, in the preface, he says, that I felt obliged to leave Hippolytus one weakness, which would make him slightly guilty toward his father, without, however, depriving him in any way of the nobility with which he spares Phaedra's honor, and allows himself to be mistreated without accusing her. I regard as a weakness the passion he feels, in spite of himself, for Aricia, who is the daughter and sister of his father's mortal enemies. Now, Racine seems to have Aristotle in mind in making this change. Remember, Aristotle says that unless a character, a tragic character, has some imperfection, his or her destruction wouldn't be tragic. It would simply be grotesque, as some indeed accused Euripides of not giving Hippolytus a sufficient imperfection, of idealizing him too much. Now, remember that in this play, we're going to have two tragic figures, both Phaedra and Hippolytus. And just as Racine suggests that he wanted to make Phaedra a bit more tainted than Euripides had, so too, a bit less tainted than Euripides had in order to ennoble her, so too he suggests that he wants to modify Euripides' rather idealized version of Hippolytus by presenting his love for Aricia, his passion for Aricia, his father's enemy, as somehow sinful. This will be a problem since she also loves him, and I think most of us are not inclined to regard this as a flaw in and of itself, but Racine does, again, in a kind of Jansenist way. Any erotic desire is somehow inherently wrong. Thus, he gives to Hippolytus, he says, something capable of allowing us to see his own tragic fall, not as the destruction of an entirely pure individual, but one that is tragic because Hippolytus is, in fact, in his passion, not a perfect man. Okay. Now, note, too, that in this preface, Racine not only justifies these departures from the classical model, but he also wants to assure his audience that while he is, for the most part, emulating ancient classical traditions and adhering to the plot of the story, he is also making this an absolutely moral work of art. And in insisting on the moral importance, he's trying to placate not just his fellow classicists, but also, in this case, the Catholic Church, addressing this powerful cultural force, a force already that viewed him with a certain suspicion because of his Jansenist past. Addressing this in his preface, Racine wants to assure the sententious church officials and readers and viewers that the play is not just a tragedy, but it is a moral tragedy. That is, while we should sympathize with Phaedra, we shouldn't ever forget that her desires, and for that matter, the romantic desires of Hippolytus, are sinful. Thus, he concludes, weaknesses caused by love are treated as real weaknesses. The passions are portrayed merely in order to show the aberrations to which they give rise, and vice is painted throughout in colors which bring out its hideousness and hatefulness. That is really the objective which everyone working for the public as a dramatist should have in mind. All right. Now, this carefully worded disclaimer comes at a time when the church not only viewed acting as immoral, but was beginning to question the ethical implications of plays written in imitation of the ancient Greeks. Thus, having absolved himself, he hopes, in the eyes of classical purists and in the eyes of the church, we begin the play. Okay, let's consider Act 1. One manifestation of Racine's fervent imitation of the Greek tragedians is his attention to the formal unity of his plays. They possess, I hope you noted, a symmetry that begins with his construction of parallel scenes at the start of the play, in which Hippolytus, Phaedra, and Aricia successively disclose their forbidden secret loves to a confidant, each of them acting under the force of uncontrollable desire. Now, when the play opens, Theseus, the king of Athens, has been away from the kingdom for over 6 months. We find out why later. Hippolytus tells his mentor, the wise old Theramenes, that he wants to get away from Athens now, but the true reason for this desire to leave the city emerges only gradually. In the beginning, he says, I am resolved, Theramenes, I go. I will depart from Trojan's pleasant land, torn by uncertainty about the king. I am ashamed of standing idly by for over half a year. I've not heard of my dear father Theseus' destiny, nor even by what far sky he is concealed. Now, Hippolytus' claim that he's worried about his father and wants to search for him is just a pretext for leaving. After all, we soon learn that Hippolytus' relationship with his father has been strained recently, ever since Theseus married Phaedra. So it isn't like Telemachus then at the start of the Odyssey, setting out to search for his missing father, Ulysses, in order to prevent rivals from seizing the throne. No, it isn't like that at all. Now, Theramenes urges Hippolytus to stay, sensing that the young man is hiding something else that is the real motive for his desire to leave. And he says, there's no point looking for your father Theseus because he's a born adventurer and basically he can take care of himself. What makes you hope that you may find his trace in some more favored region of the world? Who knows indeed if it is Theseus's desire to have the secret of his absence known, and whether he, as we tremble for his life, isn't tasting all the joys of love. Now, Theramenes thinks that at this very moment Theseus might be enjoying the love of a woman, which reveals a good deal about Theseus as a legendary womanizer. And Hippolytus' response to that description reveals a long-standing tension between Theseus and Hippolytus, between father and son, that tells us quite a bit about Hippolytus' own life heretofore and his own temperament. He says, "No more of this, Theramenes, no more about my father in love. The king has seen the errors of his amorous youth. He is above unworthy dalliance now, and stronger than his old inconstancy, Phaedra has in his heart long reigned alone. But to be brief, I must make search for him far from this city where I dare not stay." Note that if Theseus is a libertine, Hippolytus clearly emerges here as a sexual prude who clearly disapproves of his father's famous dalliances with women over the years, including Ariadne, Phaedra's sister, whom he forsook before he married Phaedra. Now, note that phrase at the end of the passage that Hippolytus uses. He says, "I dare not stay." Now, that hints, of course, and is probably meant to hint, since he needs to unburden himself, at the real reason why he wants to leave Athens. And as we'll see, it is indeed the fear of something, but it's the fear of something in himself that he associates with his father's history of sexual adventures. Now, another thing that Hippolytus reveals in this passage is his dislike for Phaedra, his stepmother. Even though Theseus, he says, loves her, and he will certainly be faithful to her, nonetheless, it's clear that Hippolytus doesn't think much of her because she has changed life there in Athens as he sees it for the worst. Those happy days are gone, and all is changed, since to these shores the mighty gods have sent the child of Minos and Pasiphae. She is the child of King Minos and Pasiphae, and things have gotten worse since she arrived. Why does he specifically dislike Phaedra without coming out and saying it explicitly? Well, there are several reasons. First, as a man who disdains sexuality, Hippolytus hates Phaedra's sordid family background. Her mother, Pasiphae, who under Aphrodite's cruel enchantment developed a sexual passion for a monstrous bull, eventually coupled with that monstrous white bull, and out of their union was born the Minotaur, a half-man, half-bull creature who ravaged the island of Crete until Daedalus enclosed it in a labyrinth, and until Theseus, then finding his way through the labyrinth, killed the Minotaur. Now, Hippolytus dislikes Phaedra because he suspects that she, as Pasiphae's daughter, may be tainted by her mother's sexual depravity as well. Indeed, even as he speaks, Phaedra is consumed by a perverse, unlawful desire for Hippolytus that she struggles to hide and to suppress. Another reason why Hippolytus dislikes Phaedra is political. When Theseus married Phaedra, she bore him children, 2 sons. And that meant that Hippolytus could no longer even theoretically be considered the heir to Theseus' throne, though indeed that was already a vexed question because his mother, as we shall see, was not an Athenian. But this pretty much displaces him entirely. The 2 children that Phaedra has borne to Theseus. Phaedra's young sons by Theseus have replaced Hippolytus then as the would-be heirs. even though Onenone later tells Phaedra that there has been a revival of hope among the people in Athens, that indeed Hippolytus, who's very popular with the people, will one day rule, even though he is the son of an Amazon. The Amazons were a tribe of women, and although the Amazon queen never became Theseus's wife, she did do something that no other Amazon women do, because these were matriarchal, virginal, warlike women who stayed away from men and disdained them. In fact, in order to be more warlike, they hacked off one breast so that they could strap the quiver, the arrows around themselves with less impediment. But while the Amazons, like Hippolytus, revered chastity, it was through the exceptional power of Theseus's erotic dynamism that the Amazon queen took him as her lover, and thus Hippolytus was born. He wants to take after his mother, at least, or at least his lineage with the Amazons, by clinging to and preserving his own virginity, very much unlike his father. Now, still a third reason why Hippolyta dislikes Phaedra has been her harsh treatment of him, almost from the beginning. It's a coldness that he doesn't understand, but that we realize soon has been caused by her agonizing attempt to control her passion for him, which has led her to try to push him away so that she doesn't have to see him, thus to try to deny the temptation that way. Now, Theramenes has noticed that strange coldness toward him in Phaedra as well, and he says, Phaedra distresses you. Theseus' new wife had scarcely seen you, then your exile gave the measure of her power. Yeah, no sooner did she look on you than she wanted you out of the way. That is very strange. Now, note that he also goes on to say, though, a moment later, that you shouldn't really worry about her too much, because what perils threaten you from Phaedra, a woman dying who seeks to die? Yes, it seems that for some unknown reason, of some unknown malady, she is about to die. So there's no reason then why you should leave. If you are, as you suggest, uneasy about how she's treating you, she'll be gone. That's one less reason for you to depart. Now, Phaedra, in her malady, is, like Hippolytus himself to some extent, consumed by what was called love sickness. That is, a uncontrollable desire that, when repressed, when kept secret, manifests itself in physical symptoms. The lover becomes not just depressed, but suffers from nervous exhaustion and eventually withers away, as Phaedra herself seems to be in the process of doing. All of this comes from the overpowering force of terrible desire in one's attempt somehow to rein it in. Now, Theramenes describes this condition, and we realize that it afflicts Phaedra, but it also has begun to afflict Hippolytus himself. Theramenes puts it this way. Your eyes grow heavier with the secret fire, Hippolytus. There is no doubt. You are consumed with love. You perish from a malady that you try to hide. In struggling to repress her desire, Phaedra, of course, is far sicker than Hippolytus. And in trying to distance him from her in order to control her desire, she has made his life in Athens uncomfortable. He's been ostracized from court. He's been viewed with suspicion by her and presumably her children. And yet, the fact that he mentions how uncomfortable she has made him, again, is a kind of ruse, because that isn't his real reason for wanting to leave, any more than finding his father is. He confesses that true motive for his would-be departure only because he finds he cannot hide it any longer, and also because he hints at it, and because Theramenes draws it out of him, picking up on those hints, much as Hippolytus wants him to do. As, for example, Hippolytus says, I do not fear Phaedra's hostility. If I go hence, I flee, let me confess, another enemy. Aricia, last of a line that plotted Theseus's death. And Thermetes says, "What? I don't quite understand this." Hippolytus says, "I would not flee if I hated her." "Oh, she's my enemy, but I don't hate her." And then Thermetes says, "My lord, may I explain your sudden flight? Are you no more the man that once you were, relentless foe of all the laws of love and of a yoke Theseus himself bore? Are you in love?" Well, of course, he's picked up on the hint. Yes, she's my enemy, and yet I don't hate her? Sure. Now, Hippolytus considers Aricia his enemy, not so much, if you will, from a political perspective, as Theseus does, but she is his enemy in a sense because he loves her. And because he has pledged himself to a life of chastity, she is threatening that, or his feeling for her is threatening that. Like Phaedra, who will also find herself unable to conceal her desire any longer, Hippolytus is tormented by his love for Aricia because it is transgressive, forbidden, and forbidden in a multiple number of ways. First, Aricia is the enemy of his father. Again, Theseus overthrew Aricia's family to seize the throne of Athens, and later, in fact, Aricia plotted unsuccessfully to kill Theseus. Thus, Theseus expects Hippolytus to regard Aricia as a political enemy. Okay? It's wrong from that point of view. And one might say that he's tormented for it and guilty about it from that perspective point of view. But it's transgressive in another way. Because in allowing Aricia to live after he took power, Theseus forbade her ever from marrying in order to ensure that she didn't start a raw line of succession that would rival his own. For Hippolytus, then, a romantic alliance with Aricia, even if it were permitted, would be forbidden in the sense that she could not marry him. She's not allowed to marry anyone, even if his attraction to her wasn't a direct political betrayal that caused him guilt. It would be a betrayal of that rule. Okay? But finally, and most important, Hippolytus sees his desire for Aricia as wrong, as transgressive, because it violates his own virginal code. His desire for Aricia seems a betrayal of his own principles, his own self-ideals, and makes him fear that he might have inherited not the Amazonian ideal of purity and virginal self-control, but that he might have inherited his father's sexual proclivities, his profligacy. And this fills Hippolytus with self-disgust and a sense of hypocrisy, since he has been preaching virginal conduct and yet consumed with desire. Indeed, one might say Hippolytus's veneration of chastity is clearly his act of resistance, even rebellion against his father's way of life, and now he fears that secretly he may be becoming like his father. Speaking of Theseus, he says, "Wrong Ariadne cried out to the winds after he abandoned her. Phaedra abducted, though for lawful ends. You know how, loath to hear this sorry tale, I often urged you quickly to conclude. Happy could I have kept the shameful half of these adventures about my father from posterity. And am I now to be vanquished in my turn? And can the gods have humbled me so far in base defeat the more despicable, since countless exploits plead on Theseus' behalf, whereas no monsters overcome by me have given me the right to err with women like him?" Theseus, to unpack this passage, eloped with Phaedra's sister Ariadne, who had helped him to kill the Minotaur by enabling him to get into and out of the labyrinth where the beast was enclosed. It's sort of a version of Medea helping Jason get the golden fleece. And like Jason, with Medea, Theseus first made Ariadne his lover out of gratitude and also just sort of sexual pleasure. But he then abandoned her, as Jason did Medea, taking and marrying instead Ariadne's sister, Phaedra. Now, in referring to that, and it bothers Hippolytus, the whole story, In referring to that, Hippolytus introduces one of the key images in the play. He uses the word monster, okay? Theseus slew a monster. He slew the Minotaur, and in doing so, Hippolytus says he earned there a kind of heroic right to seduce women. It's a kind of counterbalance, okay? But he says, I, on the other hand, haven't slain any monsters that could counterbalance or justify my illicit desire for a woman. Instead, it is the desire itself that seems monstrous to Hippolytus, an idea that we'll come back to again and again in this word and concept and image of monster that recurs throughout the play, the force of ungovernable desire as a kind of inner monster. Now, note that Racine makes it clear then that the real cause of Hippolytus's passionate desire is not rooted in anything that the gods are doing. Even though Hippolytus blames them, there's no indication that they operate in any supernatural sense. Rather, the nature of desire in this play, though assigned to gods as a kind of cruel punishment or visitation, the real source is moral and psychological. All of the barriers that make Hippolytus's desire for Aricia wrong and seemingly forbidden, and all of those that make Phaedra's passion for Hippolytus wrong, are the very things that generate and intensify their desire. We might call this Racine's law of desire. It goes like this. Given the deplorable state of human sexual weakness, given our inability to control our fundamentally corrupt erotic desires, all that is needed to ignite them is the recognition of barriers to their fulfillment. The more the barriers, and the greater the barriers to our erotic fulfillment, the more intense the transgressive passion becomes. Theramenes understands this law of desire, and he explains it early in the play when he says that Theseus opens your eyes to spite yourself, Hippolytus. His hatred of Aricia has fanned your passion for her and has lent her added grace. Besides, my lord, why fear a virtuous love? If it's sweet, will you not dare to taste it? Will you always shyly flee from it? Now, note that Theramenes notes the reason you desire her is because she has been forbidden from you. It was the very fact that your father hated Aricia that fanned your longing for her. Certainly that was one of the barriers that did it. And Theramenes encourages Hippolytus to act on his love for Aricia, calling it virtuous. By this, the old tutor means that the desire for this unmarried young woman is natural in an unmarried young man. And as we'll see, it is also virtuous in that Aricia loves Hippolytus, though neither Hippolytus nor Theramenes at this point know that. But note that the barriers that have ignited and intensified Phaedra's passion for Hippolytus cannot be so easily called virtuous. Indeed, they can't be called virtuous at all. First, she's married, so her longing for Hippolytus is inherently adulterous. Second, Hippolytus is her stepson, so her desire for him is inherently incestuous. And third, unlike Hippolytus's love for Aricia, which is mutual and reciprocated, Phaedra's desire for Hippolytus is definitely not reciprocated. When, in fact, as we'll see, she reveals it to him, he is at times too horrified even to speak. Now, despite Theramenes' advice then to stay and follow your love for Aricia, Hippolytus says, no, I'm still going to leave, and plans to leave Athens. And remember, although we may agree with Theramenes that his love for Aricia is virtuous, from Racine's point of view, as he makes clear in the preface, no, that is his flaw, something we may find difficult to accept. Well, Hippolytus attempts to, in a kind of formal way, bid farewell to Phaedra, whom he has not seen for some time, but he doesn't get to see her because her servant Onone tells him that she is too ill. Quote, eternal discord reigns in Phaedra's mind. And that is true. But Hippolytus sees that more as an excuse because she doesn't want to have anything to do with him, let alone see him. And he says, no, I'll depart, quote, without showing her my detested face, believing that she only hates him. However, when Hippolytus visits Aricia before departing, his longing for her overcomes his resolve to control his libidinal urges, especially when he hears the report, a false report as it turns out, that Theseus is dead. Because if Theseus is dead, then he would be unable to impose the ban on Aricia's freedom to marry. Now, Act 1 concludes with Phaedra's agonizing unburdening of her desire for Hippolytus to her confidant Onone. Like Theramenes, Onone is a trusted advisor who cares about her. Onone realizes that Phaedra is suffering from some mysterious but clearly colossal inner conflict. Quote, all her wishes are at war with themselves. Now, in Phaedra's case, this inner conflict seems to operate on three different fronts. First of all, she is torn clearly between a sexual longing for Hippolytus and the guilt for that desire itself. And she fears that this inner conflict is driving her to the brink of madness. Madness, where am I? What have I said? Whither have my desires and reason strayed? Lost, the gods have carried it. Onone blushes creep across my face. My grievous shame stands all too clearly revealed. All right. Second, Phaedra is torn between a need to confess her sinful love for Hippolytus, on the one hand, and a fear of shameful exposure that is so intense that she's afraid even to stand out in the sunshine. Even though her grandfather was the sun god, she's afraid of the daylight because she fears it will reveal her moral contamination for her desire somehow. She's afraid of being exposed. She's terrified of the prospect of shame, living and marinating in her own terrible guilt as it is. At least that's private. And the third inner conflict is that Phaedra is torn between life and death. Onone asks, what madness cuts you off in mid-career? You seem to be withering away. You seem to want to die, and yet you're still a young woman. And Phaedra says, I have prolonged my guilty days too far. She feels guilty, not for her actions yet, but for her unspeakable desires. That is enough. And again, this guilt is in part rooted in her ideal of conduct. A woman like her should not have these desires. I die, she says, and my grim secret dies with me. But even as Phaedra's guilt and shame and her fear of shame make her want to escape life, the sexual desire that she feels for Hippolytus is itself an impulse toward life in the senses. But unable to act on her desire, unable even to declare it at this point, she sickens in mind and body. Like Hippolytus, Phaedra hints, however, enough so that her listener gradually understands the passionate secret that she has been harboring. This begins when Phaedra says that she wishes she could follow, quote, the lordly chariot into the forest. Whose chariot? We don't quite understand this at first, and nor does Onone. But it becomes clear a moment later that the chariot she's referring to is that of the recently departed Hippolytus. She said, would I were seated in the forest's shade. Where can I follow through the swirling dust the lordly chariot's flight along its course? Hippolytus wants Onone to ask her what she means here in this reference to a chariot, so as to draw the secret out of her. But it's not just her innuendo that also begins to reveal to Onone a desire to unburden. It's something else. It's her blush, you remember, that she referred to when she said, Ononone blushes sweep across my face. My grievous shame stands all too closely revealed. Okay, think about the importance of blushes in this play. It is going to operate as a kind of language throughout. Blushes are, with manifold meanings. Blushes can signify shame, as Phaedra says they do here, or the prospect of shame. They also, however, can signify joy, or they can signify sexual arousal, or some combination of these elements, as certainly, I think, seems to be the case later when Phaedra alludes to Hippolytus and his chariot without naming him. Yes, it's a sense of the shame of beginning to reveal herself, but it is also a blush that expresses her desire, thus the complex language. Now, one reason Phaedra wants to confess to Ononone is to unburden this terrible private sense of guilt that has been gnawing at her. But in doing so, in making this confession so slowly and painfully, Phaedra experiences shame, the shame of now having another know of this illicit desire, without really eliminating the pain of her conscience, even though Ononone encourages her to pursue her unlawful desire for Hippolytus. Still, she feels now shame without displacing a great deal of the guilt she feels for the desire. Well, like Hippolytus, Phaedra tries to blame her uncontrollable longing on the gods. She says, Venus wills it. She says, love's fury rages in me, as if she had been struck by Cupid's arrow, as if she were being punished by Aphrodite. But again, the real cause lies not outside Phaedra, but within her own nature, as ruled or shaped by the laws of passionate attraction that grow and intensify with the obstacles that would prevent the fulfillment of that desire. So terrified is Phaedra of her raging longing for Hippolytus that she can't even bear to speak his name. We knew she couldn't bear to look him in the face, but now even his name is something that seems to her terrifying, as if the name itself had an overpowering spell on her. Thus, in this conversation, she says, Phaedra says, when Ononone mentions the name of the son of the Amazon, Hippolytus, Phaedra gasps, God, Ononone, that reproach struck home. What's going on here? Phaedra, wretched woman, what name crossed your lips? And now, like Theramedes, Ononone begins to understand. Okay. Do not delay, for every moment kills. Haste to replenish your enfeebled strength while the fires of life are still burning within you. Yes, to which Phaedra says, I've prolonged my guilty days too far. And Ononone says, what, are you harried by some keen remorse? What crime could ever bring you to this pass? Well, a moment later, of course, Ononone puts it together. But the fact that the very name, when it's mentioned, strikes Phaedra so powerfully that she can almost not bear to hear it, comes again a moment later as she comes closer to disclosing the truth. She says, when Ononone says, are you in love? Phaedra says, I love, I tremble, I shudder at the name, I love. Ononone leans forward. You know that prince where I myself so long oppressed, the son of the Amazon? Do you mean Hippolytus? You have pronounced his name! Merciful heavens, my blood chills in my veins, Ononone says. Oh grief, oh crime, oh lamentable race, ill-fated journey and thrice ill-starred coast. Would we had never neared your dangerous shores. Okay, now note that Phaedra and Ononone, at this point, both associate this desire for Hippolytus with the sexual perversity of Phaedra's mother, suggested when Ononone refers to the lamentable race that she says Ononone belongs to, that lamentable race. All right? That, however, is going to change in Ononone's mind. But note that she feels that Phaedra has in some way been sexually contaminated by Pasiphae. And Phaedra, of course, senses this and also when she thinks about desire, sees a kind of caution against dangerous passion in her sister Ariadne, who loved Theseus too much and died in grief when he cast her off to marry Phaedra. So in addition to her guilt then for her illicit sexual desire, Phaedra also feels guilty for benefiting from her sister's rejection by marrying Theseus herself. And even beyond that, she also feels guilty for driving Hippolytus from court, because in doing so, she acknowledges that she drove a wedge between Hippolytus and his father. So she's absolutely riddled with multiple sources of guilt and remorse. Now, having confessed then in that passage, you have pronounced his name, the man I love, having finally left enough hints and blushed enough to lead Onanone to essentially force her to this disclosure, she finds that she is helpless to free herself, even in confessing it, from the compulsion of her own desire. Consider how she explains the sudden magnetic attraction that she felt for Hippolytus on first seeing him. She says, "Athens revealed to me my haughty foe," Hippolytus. "As I beheld, I reddened, I turned pale," again the blush. "A tempest raged in my distracted mind. I felt my body freezing, burning. Knew Venus was on me with her dreaded flames, the fatal torments of a race she loathes, weak remedies for love incurable. In vain my hand burned incense on her shrine. Even when my lips invoked the goddess Aphrodite's name, I worshipped him. His image followed me. Even on the altar steps, my offerings were only to the god I dared not name. I shunned him everywhere. Oh, crowning woe! I found him mirrored in his father's face. To banish my adored enemy, I feigned a spite against his stepson, kept urging his exile, and my ceaseless cries wrested Hippolytus from his father's loving arms." Thus the guilt for that. Now let's consider this passage in some detail. Having seen Hippolytus, she says, for the first time, she has now could not from that moment on free her mind from his image that seemed constantly emblazoned in her thoughts. In fact, we're told he seemed, this image of Hippolytus, to follow her even after she fabricated a spiteful reason to have him sent away. But this new barrier then of distance, of being no longer able to see him, that new barrier only intensified her desire, as all the other barriers do. Indeed, it was the knowledge that Hippolytus was her stepson and that loving him would be both adulterous and incestuous that inflamed her love instantly the first time she saw him. She also knows that Hippolytus is fiercely virginal, that he's made a vow to the goddess Artemis, and this constitutes for her yet another barrier that makes it wrong, the thought of corrupting a man so devoted to chastity. Thus, she banished Hippolytus, she says, to protect herself and him, to protect herself from her desire for him. But having done so, she said that she then would begin to see Hippolytus's image every time she looked at her husband Theseus because of the family resemblance. She sees the son in the father, and this tormented her conscience. Love is a disease, Phaedra says, but she worships Hippolytus as the cause of that disease, even though she prayed to the goddess of love and left offerings. She acknowledges that she worshipped Hippolytus like a kind of god. He is yet her adored enemy, and loving him, fills her with horror and self-loathing. Now, when the news that Theseus is supposedly dead arrives, it removes the barrier of adultery. That is one of the things that is causing Phaedra such deep guilt. And that fact, or that report that Theseus no longer lives, leads Onanone to encourage Phaedra to pursue this love, even though she had earlier been so horrified by it. Indeed, she makes this recommendation, and Phaedra, in her desperation, clings to this encouragement, clings to this hope. Onanone says that with Hippolytus dead, your love becomes like any other love. Theseus, in dying, has dissolved the bonds which made your love a crime to be and bored. Well, Phaedra's response is, then be it so. Your counsels have prevailed. I'll live if I can be recalled to life, and if the love I bear my son can still in this grim hour revive my failing strength. But this is clearly an unsatisfying attempted resolution, because even if Hippolytus in some way shared Phaedra's love, which he certainly doesn't, Theseus's death doesn't legitimize her passion. Even if it removes the taboo of adultery, she is still bound not to become sexually involved with him because of the incest taboo. She is desiring her own stepson. And yet another barrier now comes into play as well to complicate Phaedra's dire situation, even as she now plans to declare her desire. She learns that some influential Athenians favor giving the throne now, in Theseus' absence, to Hippolytus rather than to one of her own prince sons. From this perspective, then, Hippolytus is her political enemy, which makes desiring him, again, all the more wrong, all the more transgressive. And these barriers will continue to pile up. Later, as we'll see, when Hippolytus rejects her declaration of love, that very rejection as a barrier intensifies her desire for him. And still later, when she learns that Hippolytus and Aricia are in love, that fills her not just with jealousy, but with a renewed longing to possess him. In short, none of the obstacles that one might think rationally would curb passion do so, because, of course, passion isn't rational. The more the barriers, the greater the number, the more predictably they intensify the very fact of desire in its hopelessness. Okay, now we turn to Act 2. And having seen first Hippolytus and then Phaedra confess their unlawful loves to trusted advisors, we begin Act 2 with the third confession in this parallel structure, this elegant design. And this one comes from Aricia, who confides to her servant, Esmene, her secret love for Hippolytus, which immediately then establishes her rivalry with Phaedra, who has just declared her love. Ismene tells Aricia that Theseus has been reported dead, and she observes that Hippolytus's behavior around Aricia is not consistent with their supposed status as political enemies. This is all it takes for Aricia then to reveal her own desire for Hippolytus. When, without too much prompting, she says, after Aricia has noted that he doesn't seem to be treating you in any way as an enemy. He has a lover's eye for you, if not his tongue. Aricia then says, how avidly, Esmene, does my heart drink in these sweet, perhaps unfounded words. For as a lifelong enemy of love, I rendered thanks to Theseus's tyranny, which merely helped to keep me fancy-free. My eyes had not yet lighted on his son. Not that my eyes alone yield to the charm of his much-vaunted grace, his handsomeness bestowed by nature, but which he disdains and seems not even to realize that he owns. Yes, he doesn't even seem to realize how beautiful he is. I love, let me confess, that manly pride which never yet has bowed beneath a lover's yoke. I love the fact that he's so virginal, so resistant to women. Now, clearly, Aricia puts up less resistance to revealing her passion than Hippolytus or Phaedra had in their scenes. But she is in some way moved by the same law of desire. Her love, too, is paradoxically aroused by the barriers to its fulfillment. In this case, there is first the enmity between her family and Hippolytus, of course. There is also the fact that Theseus has barred her from ever marrying, which would be yet another impediment to marrying anyone, let alone Hippolytus. And the third barrier that intensifies her desire is that Hippolytus has long been, like her, a lifelong enemy of love. Indeed, in a certain sense, she is fascinated by the fact that She loves him despite her own resistance ever to loving anyone. The very moment she first saw him, when her eyes lighted on him, she felt this wave in defiance of her own internal resistance. Now, like Phaedra, she seems then to have been overwhelmed with desire at first sight. But finally, her desire is spurred by another barrier, and that is by the barrier of Hippolytus's own fame as one who has cultivated a virginal code of life, who disdains the love of mortal women. And this is the most arousing, provocative barrier of all for Aricia. She says, but to bring an unbending spirit like his down, to cause an aching where no feeling was, to stun a conqueror with his defeat, in vain revolt against a yoke he loves, that rouses my ambition and my desire. Yes. Now this is interesting because unlike Phaedra, who craves Hippolytus because she wants sexual union with him and wants to be loved by him, Aricia wants those things, but she also wants something else that Phaedra doesn't. She wants conquest, okay? Hippolytus' pledge of virginity and resistance to women are things that she would like to overturn, and that is part of the attraction, this barrier itself. Now, note that in this respect, although Aricia is younger than Phaedra, she understands the law of desire without having to have it explained to her the way Hippolytus and Phaedra do. She knows what rouses her desire are the barricades, are the forces of resistance against it. Now, at this point, Hippolytus enters to tell Aricia that he is releasing her from a prohibition against marriage that it imposed by Theseus, whom he believes is now dead. But Hippolytus goes far beyond that by urging Aricia to retake the throne that her family once held. Consider this unexpected disclosure. He says, my claim appears to be annulled by law because my mother was an Amazon. But if my only rival for the throne were Phaedra's son, my stepbrother, I could protect my rights against the law's caprice if I do not assert my claim. It is to hand, or rather to return to you, a scepter given to your ancestors. Okay. Now, note that comparing, well, I'll put it this way. Theseus doesn't want Phaedra or Phaedra's children to rule Athens. And he says, I can't rule myself because although I am Theseus' older son, first, according to law, because my mother was an Amazon and not an Athenian, and also because they were not married, I am barred from rule. Though he said, he implies that he might be willing to try to make a claim for himself if it were simply him against Phaedra's children. And he says, however, more important though, he doesn't want to rule. And in some ways, that is more of an impediment to him than the question of the legality of his taking the throne. He doesn't want to rule because he doesn't want to have anything, it seems, in common with his father. Not only does he not want to be like his father, a ladies' man, he doesn't seem to have that political ambition, even though he also doesn't want Phaedra's offspring on the throne. Now, as a result, he urges Aricia to reclaim the throne herself that her family used to have. And she is surprised by this unexpected support. And in the moment of her surprise and clear gratitude, Hippolytus seizes the chance to declare his love, and in so doing reveals the agonizing struggle against it that he has fought and his inability to resist a love that has now clearly overtaken him. He says, Princess, I must go, but I must reveal a secret that my heart cannot conceal. Before you stands a pitiable prince, signal example of rash arrogance. I, who in proud rebellion against love have long mocked others' captive sufferings, who pitying the shipwrecks of the weak have thought to watch them always from the shore, am now in bondage to that common law. Cut from my moorings by a surging swell, a single blow has quelled my recklessness. My haughty spirit is at last in thrall for 6 long months, ashamed and in despair. Pierced by the shaft implanted in my side, I battle with myself, with you in vain. Present, I flee you. Absent, you are near. Deep in the woods, your image follows me. Oh, do not scorn this clumsy gallantry, which but for you I never would have known. Well, that's quite a declaration. What woman could resist this? Comparing his sudden surge of desire to a shipwreck, a form of bondage, a source of despair, those aren't usually the kinds of elements you have in a love declaration that would melt a woman's heart. But here they do, because she knows indeed how hard he has tried to resist desire his entire life. Moreover, Orisha doesn't require much encouragement because she's in love with him. And the reference to the shaft of Cupid's arrow is again entirely conventional in the language of love. This isn't something that comes from without, though. It comes from within. Like Phaedra, Hippolytus projects onto the gods what is really a compulsion arising from within him under the psychosexual laws of attraction. Orisha welcomes this declaration even more than Hippolytus' political support. She has looked forward, remember, to conquering him, to seducing him, to overpowering him in the face of his resistance. But now she finds, without knowing it, she'd already succeeded in doing that. He couldn't resist her. Well, what follows is an arrangement whereby Hippolytus will work to secure the throne for Orisha, and she will in turn accept his love and marry him and rule Athens with his support. This is implied, though it is never made entirely explicit. Orisha says to him, "Go, prince, pursue your generous designs. Make Athens' state pay homage to me. All the gifts you offer me, including your gift of love, clearly, I accept. But Athens' empire, glorious though it be, is not your most endearing offering. It is your love." Both Hippolytus' love for Orisha and his plan to return her to the throne clearly subvert Phaedra. Hippolytus believes, of course, that Phaedra hates him, not realizing that the reason she has exiled him from court was her fear of her uncontrollable longing for him. Now, by this point in the play, then, through these parallel scenes, Racine has established obvious likenesses among these three characters, all of them overwhelmed by passionate desires that violate their ideas of themselves, desires that spring from what each considers most forbidden, and all three of them struggle to conceal their burning passion before then exposing it. Yet, Hippolytus and Orisha clearly differ from Phaedra in two important ways, notwithstanding this parallelism. First, their desire, their love, is mutual. It's reciprocated. They're passionate about each other. And second, the barriers that both inspire and block Hippolytus and Orisha's love are considerably less formidable than those that prohibit Phaedra's. So, let us consider for a moment. Phaedra's guilt for desiring a forbidden object is both more intense and more hopeless than theirs. And to make things worse, as it turns out, just when she thought one barrier had been removed, adultery, it isn't, because Theseus isn't dead. And the report of his death wasn't a trick, a false claim, like Orestes claimed that he was dead in Electra. No, it was simply a mistake. And worst of all, though, Hippolytus is repelled by her love. This emerges, I think, in the play's greatest scene. In Act 2, when Phaedra, at Oenone's unwise urging, discloses to Hippolytus the passion that she has struggled to hide for months, for years. Neither she nor Hippolytus, remember, to this point, after hearing of Theseus' death, have mourned him at all, because each is in a way secretly made advantageous by his death, given the nature of their love. They both, after all, regard his demise as an opportunity, even though they may love him. Yet, Phaedra now still struggles to declare her feelings after his supposed death. It's an agonizing and indirect and perverse declaration. She begins in this encounter with Hippolytus by apologizing for alienating him from the palace on some cooked-up pretext. Hippolytus assumes that she sent him away because Phaedra feared that he would try to claim the throne from her children as Theseus's firstborn son, even though it was technically illegal. But we know that the real motive, of course, was the mere fact that the sight of him filled her with a painful, all-consuming desire she felt she might not be able to control. The pretext of Phaedra's conversation with Hippolytus now is that she says she wants the two of them, as wife and son, to share in mourning for the departed Theseus. But this, of course, is merely a pretext because she isn't grief-stricken at all, and we have seen it. Still, the idea of the dead Theseus moves Phaedra to describe a strange and unsettling fantasy. Here is how she puts it. She says, No, he isn't really dead because he lives in you. Always I think I see my husband's face. I see him, speak to him, and my fond heart, my frenzied love, bursts forth in spite of me. Yes, Prince, I pine. I am on fire for him. I love King Theseus, not as once he was, the fickle worshipper at countless shrines of women, dishonoring the couch of Hades' god, but constant, proud, and even a little shy, enchanting, young, and darling of all hearts, fair as the gods, or fair as you are now. He had your eyes, your bearing, and your speech, his face flushed with your noble modesty. You would have slain the monstrous Cretan bull, despite the windings of the endless lair. My sister would have armed you, Hippolytus, with the thread, to lead you through the dark and tangled maze. No, I would have forestalled her, for my love would instantly have fired me with the thought. Only I would have revealed to you the subtle windings of the labyrinth. Whoa, good Lord. What a expression. This is Phaedra's not very subtle way of hinting that she loves Hippolytus, whom she sees in Theseus, as an improved version of Theseus. He is the man, Hippolytus, that she wishes Theseus was when she fell in love with him in Crete. Not merely handsome and daring, but pure and modest in a way that the womanizing Theseus never was. Like Aricia, Phaedra desires Hippolytus partly because of his reputation for chastity. In her fantasy, then, she reimagines her own romantic history and makes herself and Hippolytus the same age and both of them unmarried, and imagines that, yes, if it was you in the position of Theseus and me in the position of Ariadne, I would have given you the thread so that you could go through the labyrinth and kill the Minotaur. Oh, if only. If only. That's what she wants. She reimagines her own romantic history that way. But what's perverse about this, and what clearly disturbs Hippolytus, is not just realizing that his stepmother desires him sexually, but that seeing that her fantasy of the son replacing the father has laid emphasis in her mind on the incestuous nature of her desire. When you talk about the relationship of a father and son and the way in which you see the father in the son and you desire the son, that makes it more intensely, more morbidly incestuous. Now, Hippolytus is first disbelieving when he hears it, and then, understanding it, he becomes aghast. What do I hear, he says? Have you forgotten that King Theseus is my father? Oh, forgive me, Hippolytus says, blushing. I confess your words must have been innocent, and I misunderstood. For very shame, I cannot bear your gaze. I go. I want to believe they're innocent words, but you're staring at me. Note that he refers to blushing. Now he's blushing, okay? That key concept. Both Hippolytus and Phaedra blush frequently, and as I've noted, the blush, a surge of blood under the skin, is the outward expression of something that can betray either sexual desire or shame, or both. In this case, it is only shame. He blushes, Hippolytus does here, because he's ashamed for Phaedra and what she's saying, but also He is ashamed for himself at knowing that he's the object of her unlawful desire. It's as if her lustful gaze at him that he can't bear to see makes Hippolytus feel contaminated, makes him feel degraded as the object of a desire that is so unlawful and so corrupt. Now, remember that blushes are also dangerous because they can betray what one is trying to hide. They are a form of exposure that others can either read or misread. Even when we're not speaking, our blushes can say something that can be interpreted correctly or incorrectly. Thus, when Hippolytus breaks off his words, he wants to flee in mid-sentence because, among other things, he doesn't want Phaedra to see and misread his blush, doesn't want her to think this is a blush of desire. No. Now, he would like to convince himself that he's somehow misinterpreting the meaning of this fantasy of hers, but then she makes her declaration unbearably explicit, and the single most remarkable speech in the play. She says, "Those gods whose cruel glory it has been to lead astray a fetal mortal's heart, mine. Oh, Hippolytus, I strove to seem to you inhuman, vile, the better to resist you. I sought your hate, but what availed my needless sufferings? You hated me more, and the more I loved you, not the less. Nay, this confession to you, the shame, think you I made it of my own free will? Take vengeance then, punish me for loving you. Come, prove yourself your father's worthy son, and of a vicious monster rid the world. I, Theseus' widow, dare to love his son. This frightful monster must not escape. Here is my heart. Here you must blow, strike home, impatient to atone for its offense. I feel it strain your sword to meet, my heart strain to meet your mighty arm. Strike! Or, if it's unworthy of your blows, or such a death too mild for my deserts, or if you deem my blood too vile to stain your hand, lend me, if not your arm, your sword. Give me your sword, give it me!" Now, we see, I think, three important aspects of Phaedra's psychology here. First, even though she admits feeling tremendous guilt and self-hatred for her passion, she again tries to project the cause onto the gods in order to try to relieve that unbearable sense of guilt. She calls it heaven's vengeance, but there is no plausible reason why the goddess of love would punish her as she did Phaedra's mother out of jealousy. There's no indication of that at all. Again, in Racine, desire originates from within. Second, Phaedra confirms that before the play opened, she had projected her own self-hatred outward by trying to force Hippolytus to leave, trying to work up ways to hate him in order to negate her own desire, much as she sent him away in order to try to resist him, punishing him with coldness and cruelty, shunning him, and in the process, she explains, the more she tried to hate him, the more he went away, the more she craved him, the more she desired him. She could not control her longing. Through these attempted displacements and distancings, it only increased both the desire and the self-contempt. And finally, she explains that the law of desire that comes through the imposition of barriers and distance is one that she now fully understands. And this leads to the most fascinating moment in the play when she, seeing that he does not reciprocate, is filled with a corrosive sense of shame at realizing at what she has disclosed, and a sense of despair and disappointment at realizing that he is horrified by it rather than aroused by it. Thus, she urges him at this moment to put her out of her misery, stab her to death with his sword. In fact, when Hippolytus holds back from pushing the sword into her heart, she takes the sword from him in her own hands and points it toward his breast. "Give it to me. Yes, give it to me. Strike with your mighty arm." Okay, what is really going on there? I think you know. In what sense would Phaedra like to die, to use her word, with phrases such as, strike home with your blow, I strain to meet your mighty arm, and give it me? Well, she wants to be sexually penetrated by Hippolytus, to receive his thrusts. That's what she's wanted from the beginning. The sword that he holds is a substitute for the phallus that she craves to penetrate her. She hopes that if he will never consummate the desire she craves with her, he will at least then enter her body and end her life simultaneously with his sword, so that her death would become a moment of erotic consummation. Now, the French understand this idea, as Racine certainly does. The French speak of orgasm as la petite mort, the little death. And this is what she desires, since she has now realized that he will never make love to her. She wishes at least to be penetrated by him in the moment of death as a kind of orgasm. If orgasm is a little death, this is a death that would be a kind of orgasm. Even the word, even in Shakespeare's time in Elizabethan England, the word die had a double meaning for sexual consummation. Now, what's interesting here from a Freudian perspective is that Racine takes the two great drives that Freud identified as oppositional in human life, in all life, eros on the one hand, the sexual drive, and the desire for death on the other. Both of these instinctive drives, he suggests, are at odds with one another, always engaged in a kind of titanic struggle. But here, we find that they are brought together. Before this, she had been torn between eros and thanatos, life and death, but now she wants eros, if you will, in thanatos. She wants a kind of voluptuous penetration in death as the only way she can be one with Hippolytus. Now, note that then this longing for sex and death in a single moment of male penetration is transmitted unmistakably by the image of the phallic sword and by the language, strike it home, and by her putting her hands on it and holding it to her own breast. Hippolytus's response to this desperate appeal is not encouraging, to say the least. He refuses to give her sex, and he refuses to give her sex in death, if you will. He holds back the sword, and in fact is so astounded and horrified that he even leaves the sword in Phaedra's hand, pointed at her own chest. Like Desdemona's failure to retrieve the handkerchief on Othello, this proves to be a fatal mistake, because when Theseus returns alive, he assumes then that Hippolytus gave the sword to Phaedra as a token of their passionate lovemaking. Having fled Phaedra in panic, Hippolytus again feels contaminated, tainted, as the object of this incestuous, adulterous desire. It's as if he feels ashamed for having unintentionally aroused Phaedra, and he can hereafter no longer affirm his sexual purity, both because of his own passion for Aricia and because now he has aroused passion in another. Flee, flee, Theramenes. Oh, I must flee. I cannot speak, nor without horror look upon myself. Phaedra, no, mighty gods, let us consign this shameful secret to oblivion. I will never sell anyone of her passion for me. It's too shameful both for her and for myself. Now, at this point, we hear the rumor that Theseus is in fact not dead but alive, and all the plans predicated on his absence by Phaedra, Hippolytus, and Aricia suddenly turn in a new direction, as we'll see when we meet to discuss the rest of the play on Tuesday.